Hi everyone. Today we're stepping into one of Beijing's most unsettling real cases, a crime so sudden, so devastating, that even seasoned investigators were left speechless. It began on a cold, late November morning in 2009 when a man named Wang Shan hurried to his sister's apartment. For days he hadn't been able to reach her. His calls went unanswered, her husband's phone also silent. At first, it seemed like a simple case of being too busy until he arrived at the building. The door was locked from the inside. A strange, pungent odor leaked into the hallway. Neighbors said they hadn't seen the family in days. One elderly neighbor recalled knocking on their door earlier that week, only to find it shut tight, the curtains drawn, and a faint but unpleasant smell drifting from within. Shan's worry grew into dread. He circled to the back of the building, climbing the emergency stairs until he reached a small window with no curtain. Peering inside, he froze. Lying motionless on the floor was his sister's mother-in-law. She wasn't moving, and something in the air made it impossible to dismiss the worst. What was going on inside that locked apartment? Why were there no signs of life, and what could possibly explain that smell? Sean ran to alert building management and called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, broke open the door, and stepped into a scene that would haunt them for years. 6 people spanning 3 generations of a family would be found inside. The question was no longer if a tragedy had occurred, but who could have committed something so cold-blooded and why. When police forced open the door to apartment 202, the air hit them first, heavy, sour, unmistakably the scent of decay. Officers had to cover their mouths as they stepped inside. What they found was not the chaos of a burglary gone wrong, but something far more deliberate. The first body lay in the living room, a woman in her 50s, later identified as Zhang Xiaohua, the mother-in-law of the apartment's primary resident. She was collapsed near a bedroom doorway, a deep wound to her chest. Beside her on the sofa was another woman younger, dressed in a white blouse and black skirt, the kind of outfit worn in a corporate office. Blood had soaked through the left side of her blouse. A name badge was pinned to it, Wang Meiling. Under a desk in the study, officers discovered a third victim, a young woman in her early 20s, head slumped forward, blood pooling beneath her chair. This was Li Wan, the younger sister of the household's husband. A notebook and an uncapped blue pen still sat on the desk in front of her, as though she had been working moments before she was attacked. In a nearby bedroom, another body, a man in his 60s, later confirmed as Li Jun, the patriarch of the family. He lay face down near the door, his hand still clutching the handle, as though he'd been trying to enter when he was struck down. The most chilling discovery was made upstairs. In a children's bedroom, 2 young boys lay side by side on their beds. They appeared almost peaceful, as if asleep, their blankets still neatly in place. There were no signs of struggle. The medical team would later confirm that both children had died from significant blood loss. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry. The door locks and windows were intact. Valuables, cash, jewelry, bank books were untouched. Police began to suspect that the killer had been someone the family knew, perhaps even someone they trusted enough to let inside willingly. The forensic team noted several telling details. All 6 deaths occurred within a short time frame, no more than an hour apart. The wounds were consistent with a single weapon, later determined to be a sharp knife with a blade around 20 centimeters long. Blood smears in the living room appeared to have been partially cleaned, as though the killer had started to wipe away evidence but abandoned the effort halfway through. One detail in particular stood out: the positioning of the children. Unlike the adults, they had not been attacked mid-movement or in defensive positions. This suggested they had been targeted while asleep, a decision that felt both calculated and deeply personal. Police began reconstructing the family's last known movements. According to neighbors, the family had been seen together as late as November 23rd. That night, there had been raised voices coming from the apartment, a man and a woman arguing, but nothing that seemed entirely out of the ordinary. By the next morning, the curtains were drawn, the door remained locked, and no one saw or heard from the family again. It was a neighbor's morning walk on November 27th that reignited suspicion. She had stopped by to invite Zhang Xiaohua to join her, but found the door shut, and the same strange smell lingering in the air. That, combined with Wang Shan's failed attempts to reach his sister, prompted the call to police. The family's eldest son, Li Lei, was notably absent from the crime scene. He was the husband of Wang Meiling and the father of the two boys. In the days following the murders, he had not been seen by friends or neighbors. His sudden disappearance made him a person of interest, though some neighbors were quick to defend him, describing him as quiet, hardworking, and devoted to his children. Surveillance footage from the apartment complex showed him returning to the building at 10:22 p.m. on November 23rd, carrying a dark bag. The next morning around 8:00 a.m., the cameras caught him leaving again, this time still carrying the bag. What happened in the hours between would become one of the investigation's most crucial questions. From the very start, detectives approached the scene with a clear objective: identify the killer's entry point, the sequence of attacks, and most importantly, the motive. The lack of forced entry was their first major clue. Whoever had committed the crime either had a key or had been allowed in. The front door and all windows were locked from the inside, and nothing in the apartment suggested a burglary. In fact, bank books, cash, and jewelry were all untouched. The conclusion was unsettling. This wasn't about theft. This was personal. Forensics teams moved methodically through the apartment. Blood pattern analysis revealed a chilling timeline. First strike, Wang Meiling on the sofa, likely attacked without warning. The sheer severity of her injuries suggested rage, or perhaps that she was the intended primary target. Second strike, Li Wan working at her desk. The attacker had approached from behind, inflicting a neck wound. Evidence suggested she was able to cry out before collapsing, which might explain the movement of the older parents. Third and fourth strikes, Li Jun and Zhang Xiaohua. They appear to have rushed from their bedroom to investigate Li Wan's scream, only to be met by the attacker at the doorway. Li Jun suffered a deep abdominal wound. Zhang Xiaohua was stabbed in the chest. Final strikes. The two young boys upstairs, likely sleeping through the chaos. The wounds here were less forceful, a fact that later sparked debate among investigators about whether the killer hesitated or was simply exhausted. One disturbing discovery was a mop and bucket in the living room, the water inside tinged pink with diluted blood. It appeared the killer had attempted to clean up but stopped midway. Why? Perhaps they heard a noise outside. Perhaps they realized the task was hopeless. Either way, it added to the calculated, almost methodical nature of the attack. Investigators turned to building surveillance. The footage showed a man entering the complex at 10:22 p.m. on November 23rd, later identified as Li Lei, the missing husband and father. But the hallway outside the apartment had no camera coverage, leaving a gap in the timeline. Then came a puzzling twist. Another man was spotted in the footage on November 23rd, short in stature, wearing a cap and carrying a plastic bag. Hours later, the same man returned, now hooded, and carrying what looked like a rope and a boxed item. Police tracked him down and learned his name: Li Ruan, recently unemployed. He admitted to buying a knife and rope that night, but insisted it was for repairing his daughter's swing. He claimed he had wandered into the complex to look around because it seemed like a wealthy area, hinting at a possible burglary plan. On the surface, his story looked suspicious, but after checking alibis and finding stolen items unrelated to the murders in his home, investigators concluded he was likely just a petty thief, not a killer. His case was closed, but the shadow it cast over the investigation was enough to slow progress. Attention returned to Li Lei. Friends reported that on the night of the murders, he hadn't slept at home. Instead, he stayed with a friend, Wang Anhao, arriving around 11:30 p.m. and leaving at 7:30 the next morning. But when detectives dug deeper, they noticed inconsistencies. Lei had been seen in the building an hour earlier, and when he left his friend's apartment, he claimed to be going to work, yet never showed up. I can't help but wonder, was this gap in time where the truth lay hidden? An hour and a half unaccounted for in a night that ended with 6 lives lost. The evidence was stacking up. It wasn't enough to make an arrest yet, but every thread seemed to lead back to one person. By now, the investigation was circling a small pool of possibilities. The missing husband and father, Li Lei, sat squarely in the center of it. From the beginning, his absence after the murders had been troubling. Neighbors described him as generally quiet and hardworking, though not without flaws. Some recalled heated arguments between him and his wife Wang Meiling. Others noted that on bad nights when he came home late, she would lock him out, forcing him to sleep in the car or on a friend's couch. The night of November 23rd followed that familiar pattern, at least according to Lei's friend Wang Anhao. He told police Lei had arrived at his apartment around 11:30 p.m., explaining that his wife had locked him out again. They stayed in, slept, and Lei left early the next morning. On paper, it was a solid alibi. But then came the gaps. Surveillance showed Li Lei in the parking garage at 10:22 p.m., more than an hour before he supposedly reached An Hao's place. What happened in that unaccounted window of time? Even more troubling, when Lei left his friend's apartment the next morning, he said he was going straight to work. He never showed up. Detectives began to map out his life. They learned about financial disputes in the family fueled by a large government compensation payout from the demolition of their previous home. Lei wanted to invest the money as collateral for new business ventures. His parents wanted to buy property. His wife had her own plans. The disagreements, according to relatives, had been bitter. Then came accounts of marital strain. Wang Meiling's job at a health and beauty company involved late nights and frequent meetings with male colleagues, one in particular, older and well-off, who was seen visiting the home and giving gifts to the children. Friends said Lei had expressed jealousy and humiliation over this, though he rarely confronted her directly. Piece by piece, the portrait of a man under pressure began to form, financially, emotionally, and socially. Still, suspicion is not proof. Investigators knew they needed something concrete. They retraced Lei's movements after November 23rd. For several days following the murders, he seemed to vanish. No work attendance, no contact with friends or family. Then a break, he was spotted sitting alone in a small neighborhood bar, drinking heavily. When officers approached, he greeted them casually and even invited them to join him for a drink. Back at the station, Lei was initially silent. For 2 hours, he sat without answering questions, his expression unreadable. Eventually, he asked for a cigarette. Then, without prompting, he began to speak. His account painted a life marked by early neglect and long-standing resentment toward his parents, his younger sister, and more recently, his wife. He described feeling like an outsider in his own home, excluded from decisions, disrespected in front of his children, and stripped of the role of head of the family. According to his version, the night of November 23rd began like many others locked out after a quarrel, but as the evening wore on, his anger built. He returned to the apartment, and when an argument with Meiling escalated, he claimed she insulted him and demanded money to host her boss's birthday. Here, his story shifted from grievance to alleged action. He said he retrieved a kitchen knife and in a moment of blind fury attacked Meiling. From there, events unfolded rapidly, his sister in the next room, his parents rushing to the noise, and finally the two boys upstairs. The confession was chilling, but the investigators maintained procedural care. Every detail needed to be corroborated with forensic evidence. The sequence of injuries, the positioning of bodies, and the partial cleanup in the living room all matched his account. When asked why he had taken the lives of his children, Lei hesitated. He claimed he feared what would happen to them without him, that no one in the family would care for them. It was an explanation that left even seasoned detectives in stunned silence. At this stage, the public still didn't know the full story. But inside the investigation room, the picture had all but solidified. The trial opened in August 2010 at the Beijing Municipal Higher People's Court. Media coverage was intense, but inside the courtroom proceedings were calm, almost clinical. The case against Li Lei rested on 3 pillars: his confession, the forensic evidence, and the absence of any credible alternative suspect. The prosecution outlined the events as they believed them to have occurred. They presented a timeline supported by surveillance footage, witness testimony, and Lei's own statements during interrogation. Photographs from the crime scene were shown to the panel of judges, carefully selected to be factual and not gratuitous, illustrating the positions of the victims, the condition of the apartment, and the blood patterns that matched Lei's account of moving through the rooms in sequence. The murder weapon, a 20-centimeter kitchen knife recovered from a location Lei had described, bore traces of DNA from multiple victims. The soles of his shoes also recovered matched partial footprints, left in blood on the apartment's staircase. His fingerprints were present on the mop handle found in the living room, consistent with the attempted cleanup. For the defense, there was little to contest in the physical evidence. Their strategy focused instead on Lei's mental state, painting him as a man under severe psychological strain. They spoke of years of family tension, financial disputes, and feelings of humiliation within his marriage. They did not deny the acts had occurred, but suggested they were the result of an emotional breakdown rather than a premeditated plan. Throughout the trial, Lei remained composed. He spoke when questioned, sometimes in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, and at other times with visible emotion. When asked directly if he committed the acts, he answered yes. He stated he had no intention of appealing any sentence, adding that he hoped the court would impose the death penalty swiftly. The judges deliberated over the severity of the crime. 6 lives taken, including 2 children, all members of Lei's own family. The law in China treats such acts with the highest degree of seriousness. On August 12, 2010, the court delivered its verdict. Li Lei was found guilty of intentional homicide and sentenced to death. In addition, the court ordered the distribution of his remaining assets, totaling over 8 million yuan, to surviving relatives, including grandparents on both sides of the family. The decision was final, as Lei declined to appeal. Witnesses in the courtroom described a moment of stillness after the sentence was read. Lei bowed his head, then looked briefly toward the public seating area where a small number of extended family members were present. He requested to speak with an aunt and uncle, expressing regret for his actions and asking them to pass along his apologies to the surviving elders of the family. The official record noted no further statements from him. His demeanor remained unchanged as he was led from the courtroom by security officers. With the trial concluded, public attention shifted from the legal outcome to the broader questions the case had raised: questions about family conflict, mental health, and the warning signs that may go unnoticed until it's too late. The verdict brought legal closure, but for many who followed the case, it did little to ease the unsettling questions it left behind. 6 lives had ended in the space of an hour. 3 generations of one family were gone. And the person responsible was not an intruder or a stranger. It was someone they knew, trusted, and loved. In the weeks after the trial, public conversation in Beijing and beyond turned to the deeper issues beneath the crime. Newspapers and online forums debated how long-term resentment, unspoken grievances, and lack of emotional support can quietly erode the bonds between family members. Many readers wrote in to share their own experiences with unresolved conflicts at home, most far less extreme but still painful in their own ways. Some commentators focused on the pressures of modern urban life in China, rising living costs, the weight of supporting both parents and children, and the competitive work culture that often leaves little room for open communication. Others pointed to the role of pride, tradition, and the stigma around seeking psychological help. In Li Lei's case, these factors seemed to intertwine into a knot that no one in the family had the tools or perhaps the willingness to untangle. From a legal perspective, the case became an example often cited in discussions about domestic violence and mental health in the criminal justice system. While the law treated it as an intentional, severe criminal act, and rightly so, social workers and psychologists used it to highlight warning signs: isolation, escalation of verbal conflict, substance abuse, and patterns of control or humiliation within relationships. I can't help but wonder if things might have been different had someone intervened earlier, if there had been a moment when pride could be set aside and the deeper hurts acknowledged before they hardened into something unmovable. But life rarely offers clear turning points in the moment. They're usually visible only in hindsight, when it's already too late. The apartment complex where the murders occurred has since changed hands. New residents live there now, and for many, the building is just another place to pass by. Yet for those who remember, the story remains not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of how fragile relationships can become when care and communication fade. The public's reaction was a mix of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. Some saw Li Lei's actions as the ultimate betrayal of family bonds. Others, while not excusing his crimes, viewed him as a man whose life had been shaped by years of neglect and resentment, culminating in an irreversible act. The debate was and still is uncomfortable, but perhaps that's exactly why it's important. As a narrator, I find myself returning to one haunting thought: a locked apartment, no sign of forced entry, and yet a family destroyed from within. It's a stark illustration that danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it grows silently in the places we think are safest. And so I'll leave you with this. Do you believe tragedies like this are inevitable once the cracks in a family run deep enough, or do you think there's always a chance, however small, to stop the breaking point before it comes?